my panel is about delineating the harm, traumatic consequences of policing and mass incarceration. And my own personal experience with this is in a parallel system, not the prison system, but the psychiatric system. So I've been civilly committed, I've been involuntarily forcibly medicated, I've been restrained, I've been given little privacy, watched while I went to the bathroom and took a shower, and not allowed to talk to anyone, including my parents, outside the presence of staff. The restraints were the most toxic. For the first 3 weeks I was ill, I was restrained anywhere from 5 to 20 hours a day. My chart said this notation, use restraints liberally. And then transferred to another hospital, even though my behavior didn't change, I stopped being restrained. And it's a robust finding in the literature that whether you're restrained has more to do with the ethos of the place than with patient characteristics or behaviors. For me, the forcible treatment had two negative effects. First, it was very traumatizing, and I went for years and years having nightmares about my experience, and I had a recurrent nightmare where I was able somehow to gather all the staff together and put them all in restraints and just leave them there and open the ward for everyone else to leave.
I love that.
Yeah, again, a little bit of a wish-fulfilling fantasy. So I had nightmares. And then the other thing is when that's done, it really deters you from seeking future care. I mean, there were times in my life since that hospitalization that it probably would have been wise for me to be hospitalized, but the idea of doing it was just so traumatic, and I had the great good fortune to have therapists and doctors who were willing to sit with a certain amount of anxiety about my well-being for the sake of honoring my request. So that's a little bit of a parallel kind of context to what we've been talking about today.
So, I want to talk about trauma and the effects of trauma on people who have mental health disabilities and or intellectual disabilities in jails and prisons, and the ways in which we can use the law, particularly the Americans with Disabilities Act, to help to ameliorate those traumatic effects. And so what I want to start out with is just talking about some of the factors, certainly not an exhaustive list, but some of the factors that lead to people who have mental health disabilities or intellectual disabilities experiencing incarceration in a way that is even more harsh than anybody who would, because of course incarceration by its nature could be very traumatic regardless of whether or not you have a disability. But I think that the literature and the data shows, and the experiences that I know that my clients have had have really been particularly traumatic during incarceration. So I want to go over the reasons why that is in prisons and jails, even though that might seem obvious. But I think it's important to talk about those reasons, especially when we're thinking about what is the remedy, at least from a legal perspective. And then we can talk, I'll give a overview of the Title II of the ADA. That could take a really long time, so I'll try not to get too in the weeds with that, because we could teach a whole course on that. And then talk about some of the remedies, some of the court decisions that have, some cases that have been litigated that I think are particularly useful in terms of bringing about remedies for people who have mental health disabilities who are incarcerated, so that they can, really just get out of there. Because I think that's really the answer is, obviously, while a person is there, having better conditions is important, and sometimes getting out of a prison or a jail is difficult, and for some people that's not possible because of the nature of their charges. But to the extent that that's possible, to either avoid incarceration or get somebody out of there as quickly as possible, I think that's really the answer for so many reasons. So that's pretty much the structure, and I don't have a lot of time, so I'll try to cover as much as possible. But first, let's talk about the factors and the reasons why it's so traumatic, the experience of incarceration for people with mental health disabilities. One reason is because when a person with a mental health disability or an intellectual disability arrives to a jail or a prison, they are usually at booking mostly assessed, and there's a determination of where they're going to be housed. And if they're identified as a person who, for example, has a serious mental illness, oftentimes they are immediately placed in what is commonly referred to as quote-unquote mental health housing, and or if they're identified later in the process, they are often placed in what is referred to as mental health housing. And oftentimes what that looks like is individual cells. It's a congregation of a unit of all people who have a mental health disability, and they're usually single cells, and people don't usually get to come out of their cells except for 1 hour a day. So it kind of looks a lot like solitary confinement in that way. There is very little access to others and opportunities for socialization as there would be in general population. And not to say that general population is any treat, but I'm just saying comparatively. Also, the access to programs and activities is very, very limited. So, for example, if you're in general population, you may have access to go to educational programming or other kinds of programming, whereas if you're on the mental health unit for people who have serious mental health issues, you are probably unlikely to have an opportunity to do that. Maybe you'll be lucky if somebody from the library comes with a cart of books, and maybe you'll get some book that's randomly on the cart, but that's if you're lucky. So there are all these restrictions. There's also other factors that I think are really important, is that the likelihood of a person with a mental health disability being subject to prison or jail discipline is greater than for a person who doesn't have a mental health disability. And albeit it's an old study, there was a study that was done in 2006 by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and they found that for people with mental health disabilities, this was 2006, but 58% of people with mental health disabilities were charged with some sort of disciplinary infraction, whereas 43% who didn't have disabilities were charged. So you can see that there is a pretty significant difference. So when that happens, you lose privileges. Sometimes people end up in solitary confinement, which only exacerbates the situation, and oftentimes a sentence could be even prolonged depending on what the charges are. And so all of that can be very traumatic and make the situation worse, kind of a snowball effect. Also, if a person is subject to discipline, there's a higher likelihood that he or she may be subject to physical interaction with the correctional staff, which could lead to instances of excessive force and physical injuries and more trauma. So all of this is sort of building on itself. There's also an increased likelihood that the individual may have also a physical altercation, either with a staff person or with another inmate. And again, the data shows that there's at least 20, in 2006, the same study showed that 20% of individuals with mental health disabilities who were incarcerated in prisons had been subject to an assault, a physical assault, where 10% of those who didn't have mental health disabilities were subject to a physical assault. So you can, again, see the differences just in the data. And then, of course, another problem, which kind of goes back to the housing issue that I raised earlier, is that the lack of activities and the opportunity to participate in those activities includes the lack of the ability to participate in some sorts of work release types of programs that might be available to people to help expedite their sentence, or opportunities to participate in pre-parole prerequisites that a person might need to complete in order to be eligible to seek parole. So that is a huge problem. They also may not have access to discharge planning from a jail or a prison, so making it a lot harder once they actually do get out. In addition, parole programs themselves may not be accessible to a person with a disability in a variety of ways. And so it's not just the programs, but also the parole hearings and the opportunities to present evidence that a person should be granted parole are not necessarily accessible. So there's a whole bunch of barriers that are in place with the way the system is set up that makes it much harder, and also set up in a way that I think actually leads to the exacerbation of a traumatic experience for somebody who's already going through difficulties, perhaps more exacerbated symptoms of their mental health disability, or maybe a physical disability, but making it much, much harder, making it a much more traumatic experience. So this leads me to say, as an attorney, and I do class action litigation for the most part, what can we do to change this? How can we remedy this? And I think an important remedy, and litigation isn't necessarily an easy remedy, and I don't have time to go into all of the difficulties and barriers to it, but I do think it's an important tool that should be considered, and one of those tools is using the Americans with Disabilities Act, particularly Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Title II of the ADA, but it is the provision of the ADA that applies to state and local governments, and it prohibits state and local governments from discriminating against people with disabilities, including people with mental health disabilities, intellectual disabilities, traumatic brain injuries. And it prohibits discrimination in a variety of ways, not only intentional discrimination, but it also requires that a public entity, including a jail or a prison, make reasonable modifications in their policies, practices, services, and programs so that people with disabilities have equal access to, equal opportunities to the same services and programs that everybody else has, and that those services and programs are as effective as everybody else has. The only time when a state or local entity might be excused from that is if they could show that providing that reasonable modification would be a fundamental alteration of their program, an undue burden, or if the person presents what is considered a direct threat, then they may be excused from that. But there's also important to know that there's an affirmative obligation on the part of the entity to, if there's a reason to believe that the person may need accommodations, to make those modifications. Another thing that's really important is that under Title II, they cannot, state and local entities cannot, and their contractors, cannot create eligibility criteria that would have a discriminatory effect on people with disabilities. And so that means, for example, in this kind of context, a program like a parole program that had some sort of eligibility criteria that screened out people based on their disability. That would be something that would be an eligibility criteria that would be prohibited by the ADA. Similarly, Title II prohibits a state or local government from administering their programs in a way that's discriminatory against people with disabilities. And finally, Title II has what we call the integration mandate, which is comes out of there's a regulation that requires that unless a person opposes, unless a person actively opposes integration, that a public entity not unjustifiably and unnecessarily segregate people. And where that comes into play in this kind of context is where you have people with mental health disabilities who are just being placed on a mental health unit that are segregated, and it's not based on a need for some sort of heightened treatment or some sort of reason that they can't be, they're not qualified to be in a more integrated setting, then they may be unjustifiably segregated and should be included. And so these are all different aspects of Title II of the ADA, and this is very high level, but just so that you know about this if you are thinking about doing advocacy, these are all important pieces of Title II that you could use to advocate that people who are in prison or jail who have disabilities, who you're trying to get access to services so that they can get out of there or have at least a less traumatic experience while they're there. These are things that you can use. And there's actually been a Supreme Court decision, the Yeski versus Pennsylvania, which was decided in 1999, which held that prisons and jails were subject to the Title II of the ADA. In addition, since that time, there have been a number of cases that have been decided, actually quite a few here in the Ninth Circuit, in California and other states in the Ninth Circuit, where they've interpreted different types of programs in prisons and jails in terms of whether or not they are covered by the ADA. So, for example, access to parole, also parole procedures, not only the procedures, but also substantive eligibility criteria for parole has been addressed. Currently, there is a case now in Massachusetts before the Massachusetts State Supreme Judicial Court being decided on whether or not parole is a service that's covered under the ADA, and so we hope to hear from the court soon. There are also a number of other decisions that are like that, and there's a whole range of decisions about prisons being accessible in terms of physical access to program access, which are really important. One other thing, and I know that I have limited time, so I'll wrap it up really quickly, but I also just want to note that there has been at least, the Department of Justice in 2013 used the ADA to find that the state of Pennsylvania's prison system was violating the ADA in terms of its use of solitary confinement of people with mental disabilities. So that is also another way that you could use the ADA in order to advocate for people with disabilities. And all of these things can help expedite a person's, hopefully either their discharge from a prison or from a jail, or if they have to be there, at least to help ameliorate and make their conditions a little more tolerable. And so I'll stop now because I think I've run out of time.
Hi. Well, first of all, I really wanted to thank Beth, Claudia, Repair, and all the other terrific organizations for putting together this symposium today and yesterday. I'm really honored and humbled to be up here speaking in front of you with all of you and those who've already spoken. I'm truly, truly humbled. So when we talk about trauma, the way individuals and families and communities experience these harms isn't as unique harms, but they experience them as in a continuum of harm and traumatic events that can occur across life. So this can be domestic violence, this can be intimate partner violence or stalking or elder abuse. Political and violence, so that could be incarceration, torture, war, trauma, and combat. And keep in mind that if we're talking about, say, combat violence, who are vets and who are the troops? So they are people, men and women, who are recruited sometimes as young as 17 from predominantly poor communities and disproportionately represented people of color, who are then often put into combat zones without knowing what they're in for. Police violence, as we talked about, and finally violence at the hands of non-state actors. So in the contemporary context, that could be Minutemen, KKK, or other alt-right organizations. There's community violence, and then there's also historical trauma, which exerts its effects at the level of the genome. So if anyone wants to get into that later, I'm happy to talk about effects of trauma on telomere length that's passed on intergenerationally. So next. So how common is trauma? Throughout a number, what percentage of women experience intimate partner violence in their lives?
40.
Louder?
44.
40?
70.
70. So surveys of U.S. women have about a third of women reporting intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Sexual assault, again, these are surveys, so self-reported, about 18% of women and 3% of men lifetime. If you ask about age at first rape, for 21% of women and 28% of men. And again, these are adults, so these are people who have survived. These people who have survived to adulthood. 21% of women and 28% of men report their first rape was age 11 or younger. All right, so this is not just an adolescent or an adult problem. This really begins in childhood. Okay, next slide. So as many of you know, there's not really great statistics on police violence. We can look at data from the UK Guardian, which now has a compilation of people reported killed by law enforcement in the United States. Last year, 2016, the UK Guardian documented 1,091. Over 100,000 injuries by law enforcement officers were severe enough to result in people either going to the emergency room or getting hospitalized. And in year 2010, the cost of those was an estimated $1.8 billion. $1.8 billion in medical costs, as well as lost work productivity. So it's an economic issue. And I bring this up not because things are more justifiable if they result in a bigger cost, but because one of the tools that we have and one of the levers we have for change is going to, say, elected officials and saying, look, this is costing you money. This is costing us money. What are you going to do about it? And unfortunately, money sometimes talks when issues of justice or equality or human rights don't. Importantly, student resource officers who are basically police officers who are placed in public K through 12 schools are another source of police violence. So over a 6-year period, 2010 through 2015, there were at least 28 documented serious injuries perpetrated against children, by SROs. And what these statistics don't account for are the repeated stops, police harassment, witnessing others being victimized, and these can also have long-lasting effects on mental and physical health. Again, even if there's no physical violence, constant harassment affects mental health and physical health. Okay, next slide. So I wanted to turn to solitary confinement. So solitary confinement is a state of profound sensory deprivation. So individuals are held in cells that are about the size of a handicapped bathroom stall. They're kept in there 22 to 24 hours a day, typically have no more than 5 hours, maybe some 7 hours a week outside of the cell whatsoever. They have lack of social interaction. Often the cells have steel doors, so they can't even communicate in normal speech with people who are in the next cell. They can't see one another. There's no natural light. They have limited movement, and as Deborah spoke about, limited access to any sort of meaningful activity. Now, not only is this used for people who are in prisons, but it's also used for people in pretrial detention. So pretrial detention, for those of us not in law, means someone who has been arrested, charged with a crime, but hasn't yet gone to trial. All right? And they can be held like this. So approximately 3,600 people are held in secure housing units, or so-called supermax, or solitary confinement in California, and an estimated 80,000 people nationwide. And people can be held in these, particularly in prisons, for years on end. So what does this do to people's health? Well, the most profound effects are mental health. And this can cause or exacerbate pre-existing mental health conditions. This can include anxiety and depression, cognitive disturbances, that means not being able to think clearly, perceptual distortions, or another word for that is hallucinations, obsessive thoughts, paranoia, psychosis, so that's sort of losing touch with reality, and self-directed violence. So at least half of suicides committed in prisons are committed by people who are held in solitary confinement. And importantly, this psychological harm persists even after people have returned to normal social conditions. So the use and the conditions of solitary confinement in the United States are so severe that the United Nations Human Rights Committee, the UN Committee Against Torture, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture have found that solitary confinement, as it's used in the US, may amount to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment that's in violation of the Convention Against Torture. Okay, next slide. So one of the things here to think about and remember is there's this circularity. Incarceration causes mental illness, and it worsens mental illness. And also, mental illness makes someone more likely to be arrested, found guilty, and incarcerated. Another circle we could draw would be solitary confinement, which leads to violent behavior, including violent expression of self-harm. Now, one of the things that's happened in the last 50 years or so is the movement for deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill. So the 1963 Community Mental Health Act was intended to help move people from chronic psychiatric inpatient institutions into the community. The thought was, well, these people are being held, let's instead have them move into the community and provide services to them through community mental health centers. Well, the first part of that happened. So there are very few people now held in psychiatric institutions. But instead of community mental health centers, we found that people with serious mental illness have been moved into jails, prisons, and homeless shelters. These have become the institutions for holding people with serious mental illness. Among those who are held in solitary confinement, at least 50% have serious mental illness. So serious mental illness isn't like, gosh, you know, I feel like I'm having a bad day, I feel a little down. This is people with psychosis, this is people with severe PTSD, this is people with severe depression. And now there are 3 times more people with mental illness who are held in detention than are held in psychiatric institutions. Okay, next slide. What is torture? So it's defined as the deliberate, systematic, or wanton infliction of suffering by one or more persons acting alone or on the orders of any authority, pretty much for any reason. Next slide. So this is reasons or rationales that are given for torture. We could also strike out torture and write in state violence more generally. So again, usually I speak about torture specifically, but let's broaden that, state violence. So on the individual level, it is said, and we've certainly heard this in the media, well gosh, you know, torture helps facilitate an interrogation. This person is more likely to share his or her secrets or confess or whatnot if there's physical or psychological duress placed on them. That's not what the evidence bears out. It's also used to break down an individual physically and psychologically. So for instance, with political prisoners, torture is used to break people down. I don't know if anyone saw an article in the New Yorker, it was I think January 16th, about the Angola 3. So this was writing in particular about Alfred Wilcox, one of the Black Panthers who was held over 4 years in solitary confinement, basically as a political prisoner. So he was held in solitary as a way of punishing him for being a member of the Black Panthers, even though he wasn't violent. At a community level, state violence is used to maintain political control, to achieve social goals, so ethnic cleansing, for political repression, to spread terror in a community, and to fragment or break down a community. Okay, next slide. Okay, so psychological methods of torture. So deprivations. So deprivation can be, say, withholding adequate food or water. It can be exposing someone to extremes of light. So bright light 24/7, or the flip side, darkness 24/7. It can be exposing someone to extreme cold or extreme heat. It can be depriving them of medical care. Humiliations, which is a big part of this. So verbal abuse or being forced to perform humiliating acts. Threats of harm to oneself or one's loved ones. Being forced to harm someone else or oneself. So violation of taboo, so this can be, say, people held in jails who are only given ham sandwiches, even though they're, say, Muslim or devoutly Jewish, and we eat those. Behavioral coercion, and finally being forced to witness torture being inflicted on others. So next slide. So how common is this? More than half the world's countries, according to Amnesty International, practice torture. Estimates are up to a third of the world's refugees have at least one experience of torture. And estimates of, this should say torture survivors from overseas in the US range up to 500,000. If we include experiences in US prisons and penal institutions, the number would be quite a bit higher. Next slide. So let's turn now to the health effects of trauma. And these include effects to the individual, the family, and the community. Next slide. So physical sequelae to the individual can include chronic pain. And when I say chronic pain, this includes pain that's not, say, in a site where someone was hit. So it makes sense that if someone's arm is broken, sure, they might have chronic pain in their arm. But this is, say, chronic headaches in someone, where the headaches are a manifestation of that trauma. Somatization, so that's when someone experiences physical symptoms without there being a physical reason for it. So this can be, say, nausea, vomiting, dizziness. Sexual dysfunction, particularly in those who've been subject to sexual violence, but even in those who haven't, this can occur. Importantly, scars or other direct physical evidence of trauma may be absent. So within 6 weeks after getting even really bad bruising from, say, being beaten by a police baton, we would not expect there to be any physical bruises left. Those resolve within 6 to 8 weeks, even though pain can persist. Infectious disease. So after rape, someone can have sexually transmitted infections. Lack of access to medical care can lead to infections. And finally, tuberculosis, which in some settings globally is actually a major cause of death in prison. So in Russian prisons, people are more likely to die from tuberculosis than anything else, simply because of overcrowding and lack of adequate access to medical care. So trauma during pregnancy can lead to premature birth and perinatal death. Two of the interesting studies I found here looked at rates of premature birth in populations that were subject to stress, emotional stress. So, and I'll give you these references if anyone's interested. So one looked at rates of low birth weight among women with Arabic surnames before and after 9/11, and found a 34% increase in the risk of low birth weight in the 6 months after. There's no corresponding change in any other group in California during that time. And then a study that just came out this year looked at Latino women in Iowa. So you may remember in 2008 there was the huge ICE raid at Postville. And there they found a 24% increase in low birth weight among Latina moms giving birth in the 1 year after compared to the 1 year before the immigration raid. And there were no changes in rates in any other group. So just emotional stress. And these are not people who are physically harmed themselves, but just profound emotional stress, profiling in raids do have effects on people, on babies, on infants. Traumatic brain injury can happen whenever someone either is physically hit in the head or strangled. So strangling is commonly used during rape and other sexual assault. And then cognitive impairment. Next slide. So psychological sequelae. These are actually the most common chronic symptoms. And their frequency and intensity varies. So some people are resilient and don't have any sort of rip-roaring syndromes or symptoms immediately afterwards. Some people are very disabled. There's not a strong correlation between severity of what happened to them and how they respond. In terms of diagnostic classifications, that's going to include depression, PTSD, substance abuse, as we talked about in our last panel, and cognitive impairment. So next slide. So who's familiar with PTSD? Okay, all right. All right, I'll be quick. So PTSD includes being exposed to a traumatic event where the response involved intense fear, depression, or helplessness. Next slide. And then people experience symptoms including re-experiencing avoidance and hyperarousal. So re-experiencing might be flashbacks or intrusive memories or nightmares. Avoidance can be not wanting to remember what happened. It can be, as Jaleh talked about, difficulty remembering the details of what happened. And sometimes those memories are there and sometimes they're not. They're just not there. Hyperarousal can be difficulty sleeping. It can be effects like, say, rapid heartbeat or anxiety. And then this slide, I used to entitle Behavior and Social Sequelae. But I bring this up because torture and traumatic events don't just affect the individual, they affect families and they affect communities. So someone who, say, has been imprisoned and before imprisonment was the life of the party, was fun, was social, was part of their family, might come back and all of a sudden they want to stand with their back against the wall. They don't want to be in a party because they can't stand being in a room with too many people. They used to be funny and joke around, and now they're irritable or angry or just withdrawn. And family members may not understand, gosh, why is this person changed? Now, when this happens to one person of one family, or when it happens to one person, it happens to one family. When it happens to multiple families, it starts happening to the community. And this is one of the ways that trauma and violence help pull families and communities apart. So my last slide, and this is a quote from a physician who I interviewed who was a torture survivor in Iraq. And he related to me, American doctors are not like Iraqi doctors. They have a loud voice and they can say whatever they want to the government. So my message to doctors in the US is to uphold the ethics of their own profession and to say whatever they want, whatever they think will put things in the right position. And I hope each of us remembers that regardless of how bad it's getting here now, we are still in a much better position than our colleagues and friends and comrades in other parts of the world and other situations.
Hello, and thank you all you stalwart folks for sticking with us this long. It's been a long day. My name is Lorraine Bonner, and I'm a physician and a sculptor. And I want to thank Drs. Rebay and Pena for inviting me to speak at this symposium, and also to the ancestors on whose land we're currently gathered. As mentioned, I'm a physician, and early in my practice, can I hit the first slide? Or this, I guess it's the second. This slide. Early in my practice, I noticed seeming connections between trauma and physical illnesses. And this led to an ongoing interest in trauma, including an exploration of my own personal history of childhood sexual exploitation. I've been asked to speak about the biological responses to trauma, the real nitty-gritty down in the cells, some of which we share with all our relations and some of which appear to be unique to humans and our primate cousins. And some of these responses shed light on what it really means to be a human being. Due to the time constraints, I'm only going to touch on the highlights of this response, but I would recommend this excellent book, The Body Keeps the Score, by Bessel van der Kolk, which discusses in great detail and with wonderfully accessible language what is currently known about trauma and ways to treat it. Next slide, please. I'd like to start with a quote from a fascinating book called The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben. Commenting on the ways that trees nourish one another through their roots, he asks, quote, why do they share food with their own species and sometimes even go so far as to nourish their competitors? The reasons are the same as for human communities. Together, many trees create an ecosystem, a forest. And in this protected environment, trees can live to be very old, unquote. Among humans, this is expressed by the term Ubuntu, which is a Zulu word which translates, I am because we are. In other words, like trees in a forest, a human is a human because of their community. From the time of our birth, we learn to be human by the care and reflection given to us by other humans. Next slide. A person raised in a caring and supportive community I like this one with all the nests in it. A person raised in a caring and supportive community learns to be a caring and supportive person, attuned to the needs of others, and finding pleasure in meeting those needs, even as their own needs are met. We are neurologically programmed for interdependence within our own body, in our human community, and in the wider world. We are made human by bonds of trust and trustworthiness. A discussion of trauma begins with the autonomic nervous system, which is called autonomic because it's autonomous. It takes care of the things we don't pay attention to, like breathing, digesting, or the beating of our heart. Next slide. The autonomic nervous system is divided into two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. There are multiple nerves in the sympathetic nervous system, but the parasympathetic is mostly under the control of the vagus nerve, which emerges from the base of the brain and travels to all the internal organs. When we have feelings that are gut-wrenching, or heartbreaking, or breathtaking, this is the vagus nerve conveying body sensations to the brain, sensations which the brain recognizes as emotions. In a calm state, the two parts of the autonomic nervous system act in moment-to-moment equilibrium with each other. The sympathetic nervous system speeds up the heart, the vagus slows it down. The sympathetic nervous system turns off the gut, but the vagus turns it back on again. Next slide. But there is another feature of the vagus nerve which has only recently come into focus, and which appears to be newer evolutionarily. A portion of the vagus nerve is in close communication with the nerves that control speech and hearing, the neck, and muscles of facial expression, and plays a large part in how we become human. Because of the vagus nerve's close connection to speech and facial expression, and its intimate association with emotions, humans learn from an early age to read and mirror back to the feelings of others. In a stressful situation, one human will turn to another, and with no more than the contraction of a few muscles, will communicate their need, and a true human will respond. This is Ubuntu, the first stress response, trust and trustworthiness. Next slide. Even in an experience of extreme stress, the presence of another person to witness and reflect our state may offer protection. But stress becomes traumatic when the human connection is ruptured in situations of life and sanity threatening danger of the sort that we have heard over these last 2 days. Whether a victim or witness, the key element determining the harmfulness of these experiences is their inescapability. Information coming into the brain goes to the central processing area known as the thalamus, which diverts that information to both the frontal lobes up here, where thinking occurs, that's the slow connection, and to the amygdala deep in the brain, which is all about emotion, that's the fast connection. If there is a hint of danger, the amygdala activates the sympathetic nervous system into the fight or flight response, flooding the bloodstream with neurotransmitters like adrenaline and stress hormones like cortisol. Next slide. Both rational thought and digestion are turned off. Blood is shunted to the heart, brain, and muscles. The heart beats faster and the blood pressure rises, and the person puts on a powerful effort to escape or fight off the danger. If they are successful, the system then powers down, and the trembling person finds a place to rest. The experience is contextualized and stored in memory by another structure of the brain called the hippocampus. In humans, the frontal lobe gives the experience language and makes it part of the narrative of one's autobiography. But when danger, next slide. When danger cannot be escaped or fought off, adrenaline and cortisol keep flooding the system, and various brain structures become overwhelmed. The experience becomes fragmented. Various sensory aspects split off from one another, and the ability to organize and make sense of what is happening fails. As terror persists or is repeated, eventually the organism may fall into collapse. The brain may become so focused on bare survival, so conditioned to its lack of agency, that the person may not even be able to perceive or use an escape route, even if one is available. In the most extreme circumstances, as the sympathetic nervous system falters, the older parts of the vagal nerve remain unopposed, slowing down the heart and breathing, even to the point of death. Next slide. Even if a person survives, they are changed. Anxiety and depression are common outcomes, as are chronic illnesses associated with inflammation and the immune system, which are affected by levels of cortisol. The hippocampus, which I mentioned as part of the memory structure formation, is actually atrophied by high levels of catechols such as adrenaline. Because the body is now seen as a sort, which is one of the reasons why people have trouble remembering traumatic experiences. Because the body is now seen as a source of unendurable sensations of terror and pain, the person may become dissociated from it, unable to feel anything, and yet paradoxically hyperreactive. Chunks of sensory and emotional experiences unrelated to any narrative memory may suddenly intrude into consciousness as flashbacks. A person may feel out of control and feel unbearable shame. They may not even feel human. How can a person feel like a human being when they have received no human response to their pain? It's no wonder survivors resort to drugs or alcohol to numb out, or to dangerous practices as a way of feeling alive. And yet, amazing as it is, there are people who survive horrific trauma, and some not only survive, but turn back to help those still suffering. Many such people are in this room right now. You're heroes. Next slide. These days, few of us face the predators that shape the trauma response that our ancestors have handed down to us. Instead of lions and tigers and bears, we have each other. Values like domination, isolation, and a pervasive sense of scarcity structure relationships from the highest levels of government to the lives we live in our own homes, creating a world of ongoing, inescapable trauma. But let's be clear, these values are not like the law of nature. We can change them. Capitalism is not gravity. We can remember who we are and what makes us human. Many of the presenters yesterday and today have gone into the specific interactions of law enforcement with targeted individuals, and I will only mention some of the issues that might be relevant to the consideration of trauma. Next slide. Certainly, any person of color is aware of the risk of death or serious injury at the hands of law enforcement officers. Certainly, neither fight nor flight is a viable option, and even standing still is no guarantee of safety. Certainly, handcuffs, chains, bars, and courtroom all make visible the reality of inescapability, and other inmates and guards continue to ongoing violence. Certainly, there are inescapable fears for loved ones. What will happen to my children? How will my family pay the rent without me? How can I face my mother? Certainly, the journey of a person through the so-called justice system, there will rarely, if ever, be an experience of Ubuntu, unless it comes from one of us, looking into the eyes of that traumatized individual, touching root to root, nourishing each other. I will close with a sculpture and a poem that takes us forward into the future, to a time when Ubuntu is the law of the land. Next slide. We are more than even we know. In the future, history teachers will also be grief counselors for children bewildered and sorrowful over us. Every part of our lives will grieve them, gasoline, Coca-Cola. Only the most advanced will study incarceration, and only in small groups with the most compassionate mentors. Our calendar passes by the holidays they will celebrate, days when grace filled our trembling souls and we became their ancestors. We don't know yet how it will happen. Next slide. The flowering of courage and genius. The children will beg to hear the thrilling stories again and again. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have slides, but I almost want to just not do the slides anymore. So we can hold off on that. So let me tell my story. Since I have to follow such a great presenter, and when I grow up, I want to be like her. My name is Cecilia Cheung, and I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and I'm an immigrant here. Moved to this country in 1984, and I have called San Francisco home since I got here. Well, actually, spent 6 months in Monterey Park and then moved to San Francisco. Sorry. Love SoCal, but not as much as I love San Francisco. And my activism has to do really with my own journey of coming out as trans, and also the time when I didn't have my family support. And a lot of what we've heard today and probably yesterday was also part of my experience, not because I had a rough childhood, but because I came out as trans and at a time when there were no protection. And so what ended happening is that I spent 3.5 years marginally housed, have to rely on survival sex to put a roof over my shoulder, put food at the table, and because of all that, I had innumerable contact and interactions with police, including being arrested, and also, get involuntarily detained in psychiatric wards, and so this topic is really near and dear to me, and kind of why I start doing this work, and kind of why I realized if I didn't fight for my own life, and if I didn't advocate for myself, nobody would, because there weren't as many robust organizations out there, and we didn't realize we have so many allies, that were ready to stand beside us, to fight for us. And my incidents that I want to share with you, there are actually 2 incidents I want to share with you. One has to do with me being arrested and detained at the San Francisco County Jail. And that was also the case that I actually testified in front of the Prison Rape Elimination Commission, and also led to some changes in the policy in San Francisco jail. I was detained, and because it was over the weekend, I had to stay in jail for 3 days before my arraignment. And in those 3 days, I was being kept with another 25 people, and they were either trans women or gay bisexual men, and they called that at the time the Queen Pod. And that's when I had my sexual violent experience, when one of the inmate forced himself on me, and kind of approached me, multiple times, and tried to initiate having sex with me. Being someone who just became homeless and not really knowing what to expect in the jail, I was too afraid to say no. So, and I didn't even know what coercion was at that time. And I felt like that was the only thing I could do, was to allow his advances. And so we had sex. It was unprotected. It was in jail, so there's no lubrications, nothing. So you have to imagine how painful that was for me. And after that, about 3 months later, I tested HIV positive. Was it because of this? I cannot say, but in my general practice, I did use condoms religiously, except of course in jail when there was no access to condoms. That was also my testimony to the Prison Rape Elimination Commission, which actually led to 2 pilot programs at the time, one in LA, one in San Francisco, to allow dispensing condoms. It now becomes like a part of the policy in San Francisco County jails that they make condoms accessible. We no longer look away, pretend that sex don't happen, like in the incarcerated condition. The other case that I want to share with you happened around the same time when a San Mateo police officer approached a lot of the girls on the street and threatened to take them to jail, and if we don't provide sexual favors. And well, that case made a big case too, because that was, I think, the first time that actually in the Bay Area, a police officer got charged with a statutory rape. And even though he's not a San Francisco police officer, he's a San Mateo officer, that case went on for 3 years. But because he's a man, he's still part of the system, even though he lost his job. At the end, he actually make a plea deal, and he didn't spend one single day in jail or prison. And we spent 3 years, being put on trial for having the defense attorneys misgender us, use the wrong pronouns, and kept calling us men, as if we were men, this should be okay for us to have this kind of advances. And so when I actually got out of that environment, you've heard a lot about PTSD. I can tell you what it was like for me. I could not walk down to the bus stop by myself. I have to have a group of people waited with me at the bus station for me to get on the bus. I could not maintain a romantic relationship for almost 30 years. Between the age of 30 to the age of 40, I wasn't able to have much relationship whatsoever because I didn't know I could say no to anything. And that makes me feel very uncomfortable. And I sat with that discomfort for over 10 years, and including nightmares. I'm still actually seeing a psychiatrist, for that. And with the detention that I talk about, with the psychiatric detention, what it made me, how it changed me was that I had no faith in the system. That they weren't really looking at what the cause was and assumed that I was a violent person. And so yes, that's when they lock you down and put you into one of those solitary confinement, and you can't even go to the bathroom. You can yell, but they normally pretend they didn't hear you. And that's my introduction to being trans. That's my introduction of what life is for a trans woman who need to survive on the street. And guess what? That's not a unique experience. So when I started doing my advocacy work, I realized that transgender people living with HIV are rarely being connected with the movement. And so I decided to really do a survey to look at what that experience was like for transgender people living with HIV. And let me go to my slides a little. Next slides, please. So this is what the program is about. What we want to do is to show the world that we can organize ourselves and we can provide the leadership that we need in order to make change happen. And next slides, please. And so we are also capable of telling our stories. And next slides. Nah, next slide. Let's just skip all this. I only have 1 minute left. No, so go back one. I want to give you an overview of the survey. Okay, that's fine. 157 respondents, in a period of a month, participated in the surveys. And what we found was that 41% of our respondents have reported at least one episode of incarcerations in their life. And, and it might be a coincidence, it might not be, that 41% of them also have mentioned that they have gone 6 months or longer without any health care. And we're talking about, these are all people living with HIV. And so, and the standard, practice is, they have to get at least one visit every 6 months and also get their blood work and also be adhering to their medications. But that's the challenge, and we've heard from other presenters already that when you are incarcerated, you are subjected to whatever culture that prison or jail is, and a lot of times when trans women are being locked down with a house with the men, sexual violence happen. In fact, statistically speaking, LGBT people are 12 times more likely to be sexually assaulted while being incarcerated. And guess what? 50% of those were the perpetrators. 50% of the perpetrators are other inmates. So you have to guess who the other 50% are. And so it's not uncommon, and when you have a system that would continue to deny you as a person, as a trans person, and not allow you to start hormones, if you have been following Chelsea Manning's case, for instance, you would hear that she tried to commit suicide multiple times before they started to provide hormones for her. But it's also because of all the public pressure. Without the public mounting this pressure, probably no one would remember her. And that's what happened to a lot of transgender people. The kind of violence and the kind of mistreatment that we experience would go unnoticed because we are not counted. Even in California, I also do a lot of work around HIV criminalizations and we're working to repeal HIV criminalization laws, but we also know that, police use that laws to their advantage and use that to do sentencing enhancement, so it's harder for us to track that as well. But the William Institute had done a study, and within a span of 11 years, I think, it's from 2000 to 2010 or 2011, they recorded 800 arrests due to non-disclosure laws and enhancement, but there's not one single case that they could tell us whether it's a woman, whether it's a trans woman or not, because that's not recorded. So that's where we are right now, is we're still in the early stages of our organizing compared to some of the other movement, but because of who we are and some of the intersectional oppressions that we experience, it's harder for us to find our voice, especially after the last administrations. We're still trying to figure out how to make change happen. But we also know that a lot of these changes, fortunately, was passed by Congress. For instance, the Prison Rape Elimination Act was passed by Congress, and that has bipartisan support. So it's harder for the presidents to roll back some of that rights. And I want to share one more thing, and that I'm going to end. This is change can happen, and a lot of the organizing we did in San Francisco resulted in some big changes. For instance, they were going to build a new jail in San Francisco, but because of public pressure, they stopped that. And now they are like redirecting those money for mental health services, you know, like for those who are post-release. And also, I think that we talked a lot about different type of system and restorative justice. In San Francisco, the reason why we reduced our jail populations is because we started using community court or neighborhood court as the models, which is employing restorative justice framework, you know, to work with the community and the impacted, you know, to really look at what they think is the fairest way to address that, to prevent, you know, like a jail time or, you know, or charges. And it's been working quite well in San Francisco. And, you know, I encourage you all to like, you know, like read up on that, you know, like, so we have a really wonderful district attorney that is like spearheading all that. So I want to stop there.
Okay. I'll just say, being in the presence of people who treat you like a human being, having people regard you with kindness and with a kind of mirroring reflection of your experience and leading other ways of responding.
And I think I'm a little less optimistic.
No, you know, I don't know that that sorts of circumstance actually exist.
Yeah,
but if you were asking in a general hypothetical.
Yeah, and I think that that's really the key here is a lot of times it does require like some kind of litigations, you know, to get, you know, like the jail or prison to change their practices. You know, in California, we have like, have sued California multiple times, you know, CDCR, to really get some of our clients receive the treatment that they need, you know, in order, you know, to survive.
I'm very familiar with the issues that you're raising. I do a lot of work with children, children with mental health disabilities, both in the public educational system, who are regularly segregated because of their mental health disabilities and sent through what is called, commonly referred to, the school-to-prison pipeline. I also have a lot of children who are involved in the foster care system and children who are in poverty. And I guess one of the things, I think an important tool, at least for now, we'll see what happens as politics develop, but I think it's really important to remember that Medicaid is an entitlement program, and that for children who are qualified for Medi-Cal here or Medicaid in other states, it's the same thing. There is the EPSDT program, and that requires that children be assessed and identified early on. There's a whole series of assessments that have to take place from birth all the way up, including mental health assessments for autism and intellectual disabilities. And then children must be provided, those children who are eligible for Medicaid must be provided what is medically necessary for them. And one of the things that I am currently involved in a case, and there have been cases here in California, as well as throughout the country, to advocate for intensive home-based services for children. And those would be a variety of services to provide intensive services in a child's home so that they can, this will help reduce entry into the foster care system, but services such as intensive case management, intensive individual therapy in the home, intensive behavioral support, intensive family support and family therapy, mobile crisis services, those kinds of things. And So there have been lawsuits, like I said, there's the KDA lawsuit here in California. We have Rosie D. That my office did in Massachusetts. And those services are to provide these intensive home-based services to kids. And I would say that I would really, on an individual basis, if I were advocating, I would really push to try to, for those kids who are eligible for those services, to try to make sure they are getting those services, because again, it's an entitlement. Similarly, at school, for kids who have mental health disabilities, you know, one of the things that schools can take advantage of Medicaid and use Medicaid to help fund services. And so some important things are like co-locating mental health services in the schools so that kids can just get those services without having to worry about how are they going to get there, or you know, not having a parent who's able to take them there. And so there's actually New York City is using a school-based, it's called school-based mental health services. If you look online and you look, the Department of Education does a lot of that in New York City. It's also endorsed by the American Pediatric Association, so it's, you know, it's evidence-based, and providing supports and services in the schools.
I think we're at the end of time. Thank you, everybody, for coming. If you have other questions, please contact us.